Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. We have a great crowd today to discuss the state of diplomacy, negotiations, human rights, and sanctions in Venezuela. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to give a little bit of background on this project that you're going to see kind of reflected in the comments. 1 year ago, at the initiative, actually, of my friend Tamara, who's on the call, and I had this idea of beginning to convene a group of diplomats, Venezuelan opposition leaders, and Venezuelan human rights groups to initiate a discussion around Venezuela, in particular around several themes. The first is the state of human rights, the state of elections, and in the case of the elections, of course, there are intended presidential elections for 2024 and congressional elections in 2025. But part of that discussion was also not just about the dates of those, but the conditions. In 2021, the EU sent an excellent election observation mission to Venezuela to observe the regional elections and produced a great report with 21 specific recommendations. So we also want to discuss what's the state of those recommendations, and when the election dates are announced, can the EU return and conduct pre-election mission to observe conditions. That two-day seminar produced a summary document, and it also produced a roadmap that intended to lay out how sanctions could be better leveraged to improve negotiations, get them back on track, how they could be used perhaps to effectively improve human rights and aim towards the elections. But all this was based on a simple conclusion, or several conclusions. The first of all was the region, Latin America, had changed, with leftist governments either having recently been elected or about to be elected in Chile, Colombia, Brazil, that was completely changing the dynamic in the region. The second is that the Guaido government was quickly running out of steam. At the time when we convened the meeting a year ago in London, the number of governments that recognized the Guaido government as a legitimate government of Venezuela had gone from nearly 60 to 11. So clearly the wind has gone out of the sails of the attempt by the Guaido government to present itself as the legitimate interim government. But last also was the conclusion that US sanctions and Trump's policy of maximum pressure had failed in every one of its objectives. Human rights hadn't been improved, the elections were no closer to being held, and the Guaido government effectively had, again, run out of steam. Again, we produced a roadmap, and then with the support of the Open Society Foundations, as well as later with PAC Sapiens and a number of sponsors, including Ariga, including Mangart Capital, Greylock Capital, we convened a second meeting in Santo Domingo. And what was always the intent after the first meeting was to expand the representatives of the group, to create, if you will, a broader coalition to advocate for change that included many businesses, thoughtful, transparent, accountable businesses that could argue for the basic conditions for rule of law and elections and peaceful change in Venezuela, but also argue for the reasons why sanctions should be liberalized to further the diplomatic goals that I think many of us share, but also to further human rights, to further the rule of law, and most importantly, to lay the groundwork for long-term economic development and improvement in the living conditions for average Venezuelans. So the second meeting we held in Santo Domingo, a Venezuelan government representative attended that meeting. And we also, as a result of that meeting in 2 days, produced a summary document. And then just a few weeks ago, we held our third meeting in Brussels, this time with large participation of the EU and many diplomats, including, with each case, more and more diplomats from Latin America. And again, the same objective. This time we pushed it a little bit more and began to look in depth at, first of all, the humanitarian assistance that Miguel, one of our panelists, helped negotiate, what the status of that was, but also in terms of took a deep dive into US sanctions and how they're not just obstructing making humanitarian assistance, which should be allowed under the sanctions, more difficult, but also in terms of how there could be a sequencing of sanctions relief to further collective goals. So we have here an excellent panel, and I've prattled on long enough. What we'll do is we'll go in the order that we have on the invitation. Tamara Tarasud-Bronner is the director of the Peter Bell Rule of Law Program. She was formerly the deputy director and acting director of America's Watch, and she's now quite happy in the Inter-American Dialogue, where you see her there. Miguel Pizarro is a member of the National Assembly. He is also one of the negotiators who helped strike that very important humanitarian deal. Veronique Lorenzo is the head of the Division of South America at the European External Action Service, and has been very active on Venezuela. And then Claudio Zampa is the managing director of Vanguard Capital Advisors, and has been a strong advocate for smart sanctions discussions. What we'll do is we'll go in that order, and then we'll leave time open for questions. If you can put your questions in the chat, I'll read the questions out. So hopefully we'll have an active discussion tomorrow. Please take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks Chatham House for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think it's very, very important to be having this conversation. Chris asked me to talk a little bit about what's going on in terms of human rights in Venezuela. And I think it's super important to have this conversation because there's this false appearance of normalization about the situation in the country, partly because of the dollarization of the economy, partly because of the normalization of diplomatic relations. And I'd like to highlight to start that engagement with the Maduro government is not a problem. In fact, I think it's absolutely necessary. The question is, what will that engagement look like? What is the conversation going to be about? And it is critically important that it's based on what is really happening in the country. The recent meeting in Brasilia of South American presidents is an excellent example of this. You know, if President Lula's red carpet for Nicolás Maduro was a Machiavellian effort to get people to talk about what is happening in Venezuela, then it's a most welcome action. However, it seems more of an ideological stance to me, but in any case, it provided space for two very different things. One is an attempt to shift the conversation from facts to narratives. And second, it was an opportunity for presidents like Gabriel Boric from Chile or Luis Lacalle Pou from Uruguay to take advantage of Maduro's presence to say what they had said in other fora in the past without him being there. And that, I think, is extremely valuable. The truth is that the human rights situation in the country is very, very far from normal. In Venezuela today, we still have three simultaneous crises. There's a crackdown on dissent. There are no massive protests. There are not people getting killed on the streets like in the repressions in 2014 or 2017, but there is targeted repression. The humanitarian situation is still very dire. There are not long lines like we used to see with people waiting to get access to food or medicine, but inequality is a very serious problem. Access to goods is very expensive for most, and there's a very strong difference between the situation in Caracas and the interior of the country. And third, there's still a refugee crisis. 7.2 million people have fled the country. There are some people coming back, but there's still more people leaving than those coming back. And when they leave, they have to go through the Darien Gap, very difficult situation during their journeys in host countries, and that poses enormous challenges for the region. In terms of the crackdown, I think it's important to highlight that the situation in Venezuela is the only situation from Latin America in which the International Criminal Court prosecutor has decided to open a formal investigation. This is precisely due to the magnitude of the abuses that were committed. There's evidence of crimes against humanity, and because Venezuelan authorities have been incapable of providing meaningful accountability for these crimes. And when we look at what's happened in the country in the past, these are not isolated cases committed by rogue agents, but rather part of a systematic pattern of abuse that remains in impunity today. And it's not a coincidence that the prosecutor's decision came after very strong reports by independent experts that were appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. The fact-finding mission has found evidence of very, very serious crimes, chain of command responsibility, and complicity by the Venezuelan judiciary. And right now, the decision on whether to move forward with the ICC investigation is in the hands of an ICC chamber, the International Criminal Court chamber, that must decide if the prosecutor can move forward with the investigation. This whole conversation on accountability for human rights abuses is obviously very important for victims. They have a right to justice. And as long as there's no independent judiciary in Venezuela, which is another fact, this will not be possible to achieve in Venezuela. But it is also very relevant to push the conversation regarding a medium-term transition to democracy in the country, precisely because no one wants to go to jail. And even though we can't tell the International Criminal Prosecutor what to do, that threat, as well as other prosecutions abroad, do provide leverage to push that conversation forward. And if you look at the way that Venezuelan authorities have interacted with the International Criminal Court Prosecutor, you can see that they really care and that they are concerned about what happens in The Hague. When you look at history, it shows that Venezuelan authorities don't make concessions voluntarily. They haven't done it in the past and they won't do it now. They will only do it if they have proper incentives. An obvious one is lifting and imposing sanctions, and other panelists are going to talk about that. But I do think we need to see accountability for grave abuses as an incentive as well. There are obviously red lines that are provided by international law. You can't give an amnesty for crimes against humanity, but a transition to democracy in Venezuela requires a serious conversation about who needs to go to jail and for which crimes. And I'm not talking only about human rights abuses, I'm also talking about corruption. And a smart model to transition to something closer to democracy, which is what we all want, will inevitably have this component. This is a model for transition that has to be unique from Venezuela. Venezuela is not the military dictatorships of the Southern Cone in the 70s and 80s. It's not Colombia's armed conflict. It's not the wars in Central America. It has to be a model that provides justice, but it also needs to generate the incentives for those in power to be willing to have this conversation. So just to close, I think engagement with the Maduro government needs to follow two very basic rules. First, it must be based on facts and on an accurate diagnosis of what is happening in the country. And second, it can't provide concessions for free to be effective. And that includes using all leverage, including the accountability component within the boundaries of international law, in a smart way. And I'll just leave it there. And thank you, Chris, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Tamara. Excellent. Let's turn to Miguel. You've been in the thick of this as a politician, as a negotiator. And of course, you've been, I think I can say this without breaking the Chatham House rule, you've been an active participant in this working group. I think that's probably assumed since you're here on the call. Your reflections on negotiations, where do they go? What's happening with the humanitarian support?
Thank you, Chris. And I will start by underscoring something that Tamara said on the closing of her remarks. Fact-based approach. Everything that we do in Venezuela must be based on facts and not in desire or not in what we want as an outcome. And second, no concession for free, because I believe it's an important logic in how to deal with the situation and how to move forward in an interaction with the regime. I will give first a brief summary of context of what happened in between November and now. The parts, after a huge effort by the delegates and by the negotiation team, were able to reach an agreement to sign an humanitarian agreement, sorry for repeating the word, that was aimed to basically do intervention in 4 areas of the country: electricity, food security, health, and education. It's aimed not to cover all the humanitarian needs in the country, but it's trying to aim and to modify the bigger trenches or the bigger parts of the Venezuelan crisis, and trying to provide help using frozen money and money that is from the Venezuelans that is abroad, protected from the regime corruption. Sadly, after that good momentum of signing the agreement in November, the implementation and the way of moving forward haven't been in the way it should. First, sadly, even when the last paragraph of the agreement that the delegations signed says that the implementation of the humanitarian agreement is not a prerequisite to move forward on the political negotiations, and the establishing of the trust fund and the mobilization of the money is not a pre-requirement to move forward with the electoral, political, and human rights conversation, the counterpart, the regime, has used the implementation of the agreement as an excuse not to go back to the table. And instead of keeping the rhythm of interaction and keeping the meetings going forward after the signing in November and having meetings in December, January, and every month until now, the negotiation process has been stalled in the political, electoral, and human rights part. And I say sadly because a negotiated outcome is the best outcome for everyone. Venezuela is a country in a huge humanitarian crisis, but it's also a country with a huge political crisis. And thinking that this can have a solution without negotiating or having a solution without both parts reaching a middle ground is not understanding the country. To this point, I believe it's a great understanding in the position that we are not going to erase Chavismo or the regime from reality, that they are there. And we need to deal with that and understand and try to reach agreements and settlements with them. But sadly, it seems it's not the same from the counterpart. Also, there's this false narrative about the opposition and the US and the international community not delivering their part of the agreement. And I want to do a short reflection here. If managing or working with the normal bureaucracy of any country is challenging and it's hard, imagine making the bureaucracies of 10, 15 different countries to understand between each other and to be able to work between each other. Let's add to those bureaucratic challenges the UN and all the UN bureaucracy and all that what that means to be able to mobilize money, to unfroze Venezuelan money and to put it into a trust fund. And let's add to that complexity the lack of cooperation from one of the parts in the negotiation process to detect and to find the money that is abroad and to put that money at disposition for the trust fund to be able to implement. And I say this because for no one, when the agreement was signed in November, no one thought this was going to be implemented in the next couple of weeks, unfrozen hundreds or billions of dollars, mobilizing this money for humanitarian response and being able to have good programs in place is not something that you can do in 2 or 3 days. It means it needs a lot of work and also to be able to organize all the bureaucracies. I will close, Chris, with 2 reflections. One is to the people seeing what is happening in Venezuela and not understanding well what that means. And that, I believe, is the common ground usually with each chapter of the Venezuelan situation. The humanitarian agreement for us is a must. And that means that no matter what happened in the conversations, we want to implement the humanitarian agreement because it's a commitment we already have with the Venezuelan country and with the international community. Also, it's important that everyone understands the humanitarian agreement is not going to solve all humanitarian situation. We still need effort from the donor community to mobilize funds to help the humanitarian response plan and to help the humanitarian architecture in the country. The delegates, I believe Mariela is here in the call too. The delegates from the humanitarian platform are not seated waiting for a call of the regime to go back to the table or for a magical solution to fall off the sky. We have been working since the signing of the agreement to look for the money, to make the trust fund a reality, to be able to implement this and to persuade the regime to go back to the table to speak about the political part. And last, negotiations is the path that we choose. And we are trying to make sure that everyone understands that this is the path that we choose. And we are choosing this path because Venezuela has a window of opportunity for political solutions in 2024. That window is not going to be open forever. We spoke in our previous event, and there was a phrase that a lot of people repeated. And sorry to go against the rules of Chatham House by saying one of the phrases, but there's a small window of opportunity. And I want to reinforce that because sometimes the sense of urgency gets lost. And sometimes between summits and between conferences and between narrative, the sense of urgency and the real need of the Venezuelan people gets blurry in the picture. If we don't have a real election in 2024 and we don't have a real humanitarian solution, we are going to keep having events like this, but to speak about another and different level of the Venezuelan crisis. We want the negotiations to work. We want a political solution in our country, and we are doing everything we can to bring the regime back to the table and to make the political and human rights part of the negotiations a reality. To summarize, we need negotiations. It can be revived, and we need to do all the effort we can to bring the regime back to the table. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Miguel. Excellent. Just one thing, the Chatham House rule, you actually can repeat what was said. You just can't say who said it. So you're in good.
So fair
know.
play. I was in fair play.
You're fine. And also, when we're in Chatham House, we just call it the rule. It's like Venezuelan food in Venezuela. It's just food.
Okay.
Veronique Lorenzo, please tell us your perspective from the EU, and if you give a little bit of your thoughts on the upcoming CELAC EU summit in July, please.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for the invitation to come here and give a bit of a perspective from the EU and a few words on the EU policy. Let me first start by repeating what the EU has been quite active in its commitment towards a peaceful and negotiated solution. It will always stand for the recovery of democracy, rule of law, and the respect of human rights. We have always kept all channels of communication open. We continue to do so, and we have given full support to the Mexico negotiations. I'm not going to repeat. I mean, both Tamara and Miguel have spoken about the multi-dimensional crisis. This is something we recognize and address differently: the political, the economic, the humanitarian crisis, the human rights crisis. My second point is let me start by quoting the High Representative Borrell in what he said in the Bogotá event about Venezuela. And he said, urgent, genuine, and reciprocal commitments are required from all actors involved in the Venezuelan crisis. And that's if we unbundle that, it means three things. First of all, the willingness to make progress on concessions, and therefore the willingness from our side to lift sanctions if conditions allow. The second one is that these concessions must be in lockstep. There must be progress, advances from both sides. And the third point, and Miguel already mentioned it, is the sense of urgency and the understanding that there is a limited window of opportunity that has been closing over the last few months, and we haven't, since our last meeting in Brussels, we haven't seen much progress that is a reality. Perhaps turning to the issue of the electoral observation mission, electoral conditions. Chris, you mentioned already we had an electoral observation mission in the regional elections in 2021. They came up with 23 recommendations that where implementation is critical to allow an improved electoral process, but also to deploy for the deployment of another EU electoral mission. Now, we need two conditions to deploy a new electoral observation mission for the 2024 elections. We actually still don't know when they are. One is a request, an official request from the government, and the second is progress on previous recommendations. So far, we haven't seen any progress. We don't have, as I said, we don't have a date. We realize realistically that it will be extremely difficult to have progress on all 23 recommendations, but it is important to mention the most important one of them. The first is, of course, the electoral timetable, but also the update of the electoral registry, both for Venezuelans inside the country and outside the country, to revert the disqualification of political candidates, and actually abolish the prerogative of the Controller General to strip citizens of their rights to stand for election, and also to revert the intervention into some parties, excluding or stripping their symbols and their governance structures. These are the most, what we consider to be the most important points to be, recommendations to have progress on. As I said, so far we haven't seen much. Let me go to the EU policy in the region, because it is important. The region, you've mentioned yourself, the region has changed. We have welcomed this active engagement, much more active engagement from the region, and we ourselves from the European Union are in the process of re-dynamizing this relationship. We are having a summit with EU CELAC summit at heads of state level in July, in the 17th, 18th of July, which is an event, but is also a platform to establish priorities and agree on a more intense relationship moving forward. Actually, yesterday we issued what we call our joint communication on relations with between the EU, Latin America, and the Caribbean, that contains a new agenda and 6 pillars to promote peace and security, democracy, rule of law, and the respect of human rights. That also has the strand of humanitarian aid, but that is interesting or innovative in its addressing inequalities through what we call our global gateway investments, and that's a new agenda, a new investment strategy for green and digital transitions. Now, reflects the EU will to be more present in Latin America. When it comes to Venezuela, we do see the potential of cooperation in a number of areas, and in particular in energy, in environment and climate change. There's still a number, despite the difficulties, we still have a number of EU companies operating in the oil and gas sector. And in particular, and I mentioned that back in our meeting in Brussels, we see an opportunity to work in the gas sector by starting to address the highly negative environmental impacts of the gas flaring. Venezuela currently burns the equivalent consumption of a mid-sized country like Spain. And the country is in need of gas, the region's in need of gas, and so are we. So there's a lot of willingness to go into further cooperation. I think this is a relatively new development from our side, but of course, and both Tamara and Miguel said it, there cannot be unilateral concessions. These concessions need to go in lockstep with progress from the Venezuelan government. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. And actually, there's a question in the chat line that starts to get at the question of European companies investing in gas. So I'll probably get back to you with that question in a second. What I said earlier, I'm willing to say it, that sanctions have failed in terms of generating, or the maximum pressure strategy has failed in generating the sort of change the Trump administration wanted. There's another element to that. First of all, is that sanctions need to be leveraged. Sometimes it feels when you apply sanctions heavily and impose on them a set of conditions that are not clear, sort of led yourself into a dead end. But also, of course, they need to be leveraged in a way that can produce change, and we haven't quite seen that happen yet. But there's another failure of sanctions, which we are beginning to see, which is in terms of hurting the US's and Europe's own national interests or regional interests, in the case of gas, for example, but also in the case of finance. So one of the participants in our meetings now, and the last two has been Claudio Zampos. Claudio, talk to us a little bit from your perspective on what sanctions have meant and their impact.
Okay, thank you, Chris, for inviting me and for this excellent initiative. Also because you are inviting the private sector, I think is an important player here. So basically, I will start with the idea that there is this perception that human rights, democratic institutions, free and fair elections are not important, they are not relevant for investors. I think this is a wrong perception because, you know, the world of investing has changed a lot in the last, let's say, 10 years. I'm sure you're familiar with the ESG, but even with investors that they are not following ESG policies, I mean, the fact that the countries where they invest, they follow human rights, the rule of law, institutions are becoming very important. I'm saying this because I want to touch the issue that Chris mentioned about sanctions. When sanctions are put in place, sometimes the country that put in place the sanctions doesn't consider the collateral damage that could be done, also with related to the issues that I mentioned. Why? Because, you know, the institutional investors today are very important. They are engaged with the country. So if you put in place sanctions like in 2019, the United States did with US investors, preventing them to stay invested in Venezuela, they created a vacuum in this space, generating a significant outflows of bonds from the United States to the rest of the world, initially in Europe, but then in other countries. So it means that instead of having leverage, influence, and also caring about what happened in the country, basically the new investors, the new bondholders are investors that not necessarily are interested about the future of the country. Not only in terms of what's happening now, but also what will happen in the future. Because, you know, again, based on my experience in many decades in restructuring, I think tomorrow, when possibly there will be a democratic transition, a new government, I mean, you need investors that they understand the professionalism, they have relationship with the relevant players in the markets, they talk with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the Paris Club, with the US Treasury. And so the fact that this sanction, this secondary market trading sanction generated this outflow of bonds, and we are estimating that 15, 20 billions of bonds left the United States, even this year. And you're having this situation, I mean, is very detrimental for the future of the country. Again, I want to stress the point that the geography and the quality of the investors matters, is important. To have one investor or the other is make a difference. To have a big institutional US investor still invested in Venezuela is important for the future of the country. To have an investor coming from a questionable jurisdiction that are not interested to get engaged in the future, I mean, that's eventually will be an issue. And we see what's happening today also in terms also of the size of the debt with the saga of Citgo. Initially, Citgo was a problem and one not a huge problem. Now is a big problem. And it will happen the same thing with the debt if it's not solved in the right manner. So that's something I want to stress, because again, sometimes there is the tendency to say, okay, that is not important, we have other issues to solve, but what the decision they are taking today will have an impact in the future. And so it's very important that relevant actors to start to think about this, because, you know, there will be no recovery without new money in the country, new investments, possibly debt equity swap operations. And so it's important that key investors, especially in the West, are still involved in the country and doesn't isolate the country like it will happen if eventually this sanction will stay in place. So also for us, it's very important to avoid litigation so that we can avoid spending legal precious resources, ourselves, the opposition, and the other relevant actors. And that is very also important, and we are trying to help on this side to avoid eventual litigation in the future. And just to finish, I mean, in a moment where we're having this very critical situation with Russia and the Ukraine, I think is, and we are talking about being very united between the United States and Europe, I think it's extremely important to have a level playing field here. So we are having a situation where you have sanctions in the US, not sanctions in Europe on the financial sanctions. Then you have a situation with oil, the Chevron can do business, but any Repsol, not sure. So I think why are not having a level playing field on these issues, so that, again, we, in a multipolar world, the West is behaving in a very similar way, and it will make the situation easier on the future. So these are mainly my main points I want to stress again. It's important that all the relevant actors don't dismiss the role of the investors, because again, it's easy sometimes to say it's not important now, we have other issues. I understand, we have the human rights, we have the elections, and this is an issue that we can deal later. But if you don't deal it now, later will be a big issue that you regret not facing it now. Thank you.
Excellent. And of course, the point being also the quality of investors deteriorates on the sanctions when you block out. And of course, quality of bondholders in any future negotiation.
Yeah, if I want to be very explicit on this, at the moment you have, just to give you some numbers, let's say 10 years ago, Venezuela in the JP Morgan index was the third weighting. So it means for 8.5%. And the main buyers were institutional US investors. So the people that are investing in Venezuela were the mom and pop and the savers. So it's paradox. It's not, let's call it speculators. Was the traditional savings, and now will be the opposite, because with bonds trading a few cents, the next investors will be someone that has a completely different agenda. So I'm wondering, again, as I said before, the quality of investors is important, because if you are in a US investor, at the end of the day, you have a board, you have stakeholders, you deal with the US authorities. But if you are someone from Emirates, from Turkey, from Asia, certain countries, or even if you run some Russian money, I'm not sure your reference counterparty is the United States these days. So I mean, this is what the sanctions created. They created this dislocation in the markets that paradoxically is favoring countries that I'm not sure the Venezuela opposition is happy tomorrow to deal with.
Excellent. We have Mariela Magallanes who's going to say a few words, but before we have a number of questions. Mariela is also one of the negotiators. Miguel mentioned her, and she's been a participant in our workshops. So do you want to just say a few words, Mariela, and then we'll turn to the accumulating questions we have on the chat and your reflections on the negotiations.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Chatham House for this meeting.
Puedes hablar en español si quieres, pero
Okay.
muy rápido porque podemos, sí, pero sí, lo hace más fácil. Sí.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. And sorry for everyone. Saludos a Tamara, a Miguel y a Veronique y a Claudio. Chao, Claudio. Sí, bueno, buenas tardes a todos y gracias por la oportunidad de poder conversar en este encuentro. Y como ustedes saben, para nosotros el proceso de negociación sigue en un momento muy complejo. Por supuesto, nosotros de la plataforma unitaria seguimos construyendo esfuerzos para el regreso a México, entendiendo que esa es la solución para los venezolanos, ¿no? Y que este proceso de negociación con un acuerdo serio y acordado entre venezolanos puede lograr mejor la transición a la democracia en Venezuela. No sé si ustedes saben, pero para nosotros es preocupante que ya prácticamente por parte del régimen están trabajando para un cambio de manera unilateral del CNE. Eso genera preocupación porque sería un CNE no acordado entre las partes, lo que aumentaría, por supuesto, la crisis y no generaría confianza en el elector. Por otro lado, ayer la Comisión Nacional de Primarias lanzó una plataforma para que los venezolanos que están en el exterior puedan ejercer su derecho a votar en este proceso de primaria, lo que no quiere decir que ese derecho pueda darse para el 2024. Sin embargo, la cantidad de personas que están intentando inscribirse es una muestra de la necesidad que tienen los venezolanos de recuperar sus derechos cívicos y políticos, en este caso el derecho a votar. También tenemos la visita anunciada por parte de Karen Kam en las últimas horas para la visita a Venezuela. Esto ha generado una expectativa en la ciudadanía y tenemos entendido que va a tener también encuentros con la sociedad civil. Por supuesto, en Venezuela sigue la violación de los derechos humanos y hasta ahora el régimen no ha dado tampoco muestras de liberación de los presos políticos. Sin embargo, desde la plataforma unitaria creemos que ha sido un avance el hecho de que nuestros aliados internacionales, especialmente los Estados Unidos, ha permitido que se pueda ya dar paso a la constitución del fondo humanitario. Sin embargo, sabemos que esta no es la solución para Venezuela, pero es importante dar señales de que a los venezolanos comenzar a trabajar sobre todo en las áreas más afectadas que son los servicios básicos, electricidad, agua, y en este caso esto daría un impacto directo e inmediato en el ámbito de comida y salud, que cada vez es más precario. Nosotros agradecemos profundamente no solamente todos los esfuerzos que desde Chatham House se están haciendo con todos nuestros aliados y quienes están involucrados para seguir construyendo este camino a la solución de la crisis política. Sin embargo, el régimen aún tiene mucha resistencia en volver a México y tenemos que seguir trabajando para que ese regreso sea posible y podamos entonces, en cara al 2024, poder tener unas elecciones confiables y poder generar el cambio político y la transición a la democracia en Venezuela. Gracias, Cris, por la oportunidad. Saludos a todos una vez más y estamos en contacto y me encantó volver a encontrarnos. Gracias.
No, gracias, Mariela. Es un gusto trabajar contigo y la verdad es que es un honor poder jugar un papel muy pequeño en esta situación. Okay, so we have a number of good questions. I'm going to pose one here that is anonymous, and I don't know whether anyone's going to want to answer it, but I will if no one else wants to. And then we have a number of others. But the first one is, what are you going to do about the Guaido fans still in DC that back his party, which does not seem to favor these elections or negotiations, and the fact that Maria Corina Machado is running but expecting conditions that are not possible and saying that she rejects negotiations?
I volunteer myself for that, if you want.
Oh, you're a brave man, Miguel.
Yeah, I believe it's always easy to say, and the common place to go is that the Venezuelan opposition is divided. And it's something that you can listen, and I am a member of the opposition, and I receive that message sometimes as an excuse, sometimes as a real concern, but it's something common to hear. And I believe that's part of our wrong perception. All the opposition, from the most hardliner part of the opposition to the most moderate part of the opposition, are aligned and together in trying to make this negotiation a reality. All the opposition is aligned in electoral participation. All the members of the opposition, no matter how hardline or moderate their narrative are willing to participate in 2024 and to participate in the opposition primaries to be held in the next October. And I believe it's important for everyone to understand this, because all the decisions in the humanitarian platform delegation are being taken by consensus. And that means that Mariela from Causa R, Luis Aquiles from Acción Democrática, Lester from Voluntad Popular, Tomás from Primero Justicia, Blythe and Claudia from the Independent Movement are all together in this. And about Maria Corina and the primaries, what we're doing is a coalition effort. And all the coalitions and all the elections have different voices, have different approaches, have different opinions. But at the end, this is a coalition. And in that coalition, there's a common understanding and a common ground about persuading the regime to have a real election in 2024. And in the worst case scenario, participate in 2024 and try to make that election something to compete on.
Thank you. One of the questions we've raised consistently in the workshop is what is the threshold for elections in terms of the conditions. There's no answer to that, but it is obviously going to, how the elections are conducted is going to be important. And it's sort of the very long and detailed list that was provided by the EU's election observation mission has, again, 21 or so recommendations. Not all of them will be possible. So the question is what is sufficient? But I think let's get the date for the elections first and get the EU to conduct a pre-election monitoring mission first before we begin to even discuss that, I think is the, anyone else want to take that very hot potato? No, understandable.
I can keep taking hot potatoes if you want, but we can.
Again, your courage is admirable. So there's also the question here, is the Biden, this is a tough one, but I think Veronique, you may be able to want to give this a little bit of a try. Is the Biden administration planning to do natural gas licenses for Eni and Repsol as one way to advance the negotiations and to help the EU on natural gas issues that have emerged from the war in Ukraine? Now, Veronique, I know you're not with the Biden administration, but obviously you have a certain dog in this fight, given your member countries in the EU and companies. Your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. The first thing is that I can't really answer for the Biden administration, and I have no idea what they will do. But of course, from the point of view of EU interests and EU companies, what Claudio said is absolutely right. What we need is a level playing field. So whatever concessions and licenses were given to US companies should also be granted to EU companies if requested.
And let me just I'm not speaking obviously on the behalf of the EU or the Biden administration, but I think I've heard a number of reactions within these workshops is that the United States went to EU and asked them to follow them on the sanctions, and then is not really engaging fully and treating the playing field as being level enough as it seeks to change those sanctions. Hopefully this is changing. Hopefully there is more appetite to ensure that there's a level playing field and that the sanctioned countries or companies are treated, or the companies that are affected by the sanctions are treated more equally. Another question, this one goes to Veronique and Miguel. Does the opposition agree that the conditions Veronique has identified are the minimum conditions necessary? Could we see a situation where the opposition accepts conditions for the 2024 election that fall short of the EU minimums? Miguel,
Until now, Chris, we have a really good channel of coordination and communication with the European Union, and all the, let's say, the minimum threshold for what is an acceptable election is mostly the same for the Venezuelan opposition than for the European Union to send an electoral observation mission. Remember that this is to observe an election and to make sure there's no fraud during the election. It's not to whitewash an election. And understanding that is the reason of those kind of electoral observation missions, the threshold is a common threshold. We understand we are not going to have Switzerland kind of elections, that we are not going to have all the recommendations that the European Union issued after the 2021 elections, but we have a common ground on the minimum threshold for that. And even in the worst scenario, what we have tried to do this whole time is to keep the channels of communication open and to be totally honest and frontal with our allies. The last time we had a couple of hiccups in the time. We didn't have internal consensus of everyone for the electoral observation mission. I believe we're past that chapter now. Everyone in Venezuela understands the importance of observation and the minimum needed for that election. So I don't believe that scenario is a possible scenario. And if we reach to that, I'm sure we're going to have a discussion with the European partners and trying to have a joint common approach to that situation.
Thank you. Veronique, do you want to, it's a delicate.
Perhaps a couple of observations. There's no such thing as minimum standards. There's always a relative a judgment. It's the way each election is conducted is of course relative. The purpose of an electoral observation mission, which is a technical mission, is precisely to identify the areas where improvement is needed. And what's interesting about Venezuela is that we have that foundation already because of the EOM in 2021. As you say, there's we're not going to get progress on all 23 recommendations, and they span across a number of, from civic education to the training of members of the voting booths, a number of things, but the most important I have mentioned. It's about the registry. It's about the disqualification of candidates. It's about the reverting the stripping of the political parties. And these are some of the crucial areas where we do expect progress.
Obviously, and you're not in Caracas, although there is a blackout, it seems. Oh, there we go. Tamara, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment to add to this. And there's another question there asking, like, can someone be more explicit about what realistic concessions are, or what are you looking for from the Maduro government? And I think we shouldn't frame this discussion about minimum electoral conditions as one only talking about the opposition. Obviously, the opposition wants minimum electoral conditions, but what's evident when you look at what the Maduro government has been doing recently is that they are very interested in international legitimacy. And they're interested in that, some may care about the international legitimacy, but it's very likely that they need that to have access to markets, to have access to money that they need. So, it is pretty realistic to request some basic concessions in terms of electoral conditions if you look at this from that lens, and you understand that fairly close to free and fair elections is important to both sides, and that's why this provides the EU a lot of leverage when talking about electoral conditions. And it's that conversation that needs to reflect that minimum conditions are important for both sides. And that's what makes it more realistic, I think, in terms of a request.
Yes, I think that's, so there's a lot of questions. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read all of them, and then we'll do a final round. Mariela, you can also weigh in, and then pick the questions you feel most comfortable answering. That way Miguel doesn't have to be put on the spot every time. And this one is particularly, in the long term, what significance, if any, do Guaido's supporters have in regards to the security and social stability in the country? That's one. Many of you have noted that concessions cannot be unilateral. Could you be more explicit about what realistic concessions one is looking for the Maduro government? You already answered this one, Tamara, but I'll just read it. Can we still hope that any elections in Venezuela will be free and fair under Maduro and his clique? Another is, from the point of view of the panelists, what are the reasons behind the Maduro government's unwillingness to seek a negotiated solution during at least the past 6 months? Another one from Bruno Ciufatelli. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen that the regime has been attacking the 2015 NA for the Citgo situation, also fights inside the opposition about the use of funds to fund the opposition bureaucracy. So the impression from the outside is that the two sides, Maduro and opposition, are further apart on treating assets and debt, a topic of discussion on the political agenda. Can Miguel make a comment on this? This one was directly to you, so you have no choice of getting out of that one. Thank you so much for the excellent seminar. It's not a question, it's just a compliment. I like to respond well to positive reinforcement. Thank you, Natasha. Can I ask the panel if knows anything about the current Venezuelan relations with Guyana and the border disputes, in particular with new oil discovered in the region? Another one, which is not by Mark Fierstein, it's someone using his account. We often focus on the questions required for elections by the opposition, but what about the conditions for the regime to survive the election and not end up in jail? Much would go to the candidate the opposition puts forward, and much on any deals that are made along the way. would seem long term that this is the most important question, but doesn't seem the focus of many. Okay. What is likelihood? Oh, here's another one, which I don't think anyone can answer, but I'm going to weigh in on this when we do the final wrap up. What is the likelihood of the Biden administration taking a stance on lifting the securities trading ban on Venezuela PDVSA government debt? Any appetite from the US government perspective to soften their stance on sanctions against Venezuela as we approach a US election year? And then last, is it difficult to think that there will be an election without speaking and agreeing on guarantees? What do you think about this? How can this issue be addressed? Guarantees, I assume, for security and safety. Let's actually go somewhat in reverse order. I'm going to give you the final word, Mariela, but we're going to go to Claudia first. The one on the securities in particular is relevant.
No, I just would like to say that a few weeks ago, Jake Sullivan made a speech where we said that the US government is a learning organism.
It's a generous interpretation, but okay.
So if he is a learning organism, I think he will, if they will scrutinize the sanctions effect and also the way that are generating all these collateral effects that I mentioned before, I think they will reach the conclusion at a certain point that they could delink certain sanctions from what they can obtain from Maduro. Because, we keep saying leverage, but we should not forget that the leverage is high at the beginning, but as the years pass, the leverage is collapsing. So now, these sanctions were put in place 4 years ago, and after a few years, the leverage will disappear completely. This is what a lot of papers on sanctions that have been published in the last few years tells you. So basically, I tend to think that eventually the US government will realize that this kind of sanctions, some sanctions are not effective, and so they could modify them. And I say this because, again, they mentioned many times that they want smart sanctions, they want target sanctions. So it's legitimate for the US to put sanctions. Okay, some people debate that. But again, I'm confident that eventually they will realize that these kind of sanctions that generate what I said before, these significant outflows of bonds outside the US is against the US interest. And so they will review them.
I would just second what Claudia said. And I think the argument is very clear, and we're seeing the migration of bonds in ways that are detrimental to US interests and long-term stability. Let's go. Okay, Miguel, did you want to?
The hot potatoes, yeah. I will go in the same order. I've seen in the audience a couple questions like trying to do specifically about Guaido supporters, or I must say that the opposition coalition, the Unitarian Platform, everyone is aligning what we are saying here, and why I believe this is important, because a good way to help the democratic forces in Venezuela is not fostering or going deeper into divisions that we are trying to get over, and not to be a hostage of the narrative about the divided opposition, because that doesn't help to a diverse coalition that is trying to work together in the same path. And I believe that even with the most hardliner part of our coalition, all the humanitarian efforts, negotiation, and electoral efforts are aligned. And I believe the result of that is what we're seeing in the negotiation team and in the delegation. Second, about unilateral concessions, I will give a couple examples. I understand everyone wants to buy, everyone no, but a lot of countries wants to buy oil and liquid gas and want to do investments in the energetic market. And we understand that as a reality. Don't do it for free. Please don't do it only thinking in the economy of your countries. Do it also thinking in the reinstitutionalization of Venezuela and how any of those decisions can help in the negotiation process and in the building up of a 2024 for the Venezuelans. You want to appoint an ambassador. You want to send a diplomatic mission. You want to send a high-level interaction. Ask for something in exchange. That level of interaction helps the regime to have legitimacy and help to the narrative of normalization in Venezuela. Ask for something. A prisoner, an exile, a political decision, but there's small steps that everyone can help the democratic forces to be taken in the country. And I will relate that with the unwillingness of the regime to negotiate. If the regime feels that the worst part is already over, that all the pressure is already over, and the alternative to the failure of the maximum pressure is no pressure at all, and they just have to wait, they're never going to reach an agreement. And I believe that message of sense of urgency have to be also in the same line of sending the message to the regime that there's no free lunch on this, that they have to take decisions in order to be recognized and be reinstituted in the international community. About funds and bureaucracy, the Bruno question that was directly to me, what we are saying is that we want to use the frozen funds to protect the assets and not only to fund bureaucracy on the opposition. And that discussion is always a hard discussion. We, as opposition, love to do discussions in the public opinion and to fight in the light of all the cameras instead of having private conversations and doing this in close quarters. That adds to the normal drama of any political decision. But on the asset protection and the asset control, there's no fracture within the opposition. Everyone is helping on this, and the discussion is about how to use better use of the money. For us, and we have said that to the regime, and I agree with what Claudio has said in the past, all the financial discussion also will need to be part at some point of the political discussion, because if we want to govern the country and we want to rebuild it, we need the economy and the finance life of the country to be in the best way possible. And last, there's two small things that also are related. Mark Furstein question, I believe that's also accurate, and that's true. Part of this process is how we can show to a regime that there's life after power, that they can coexist without being in Miraflores, that they can be a political reality in the country without being prosecuted or harassed, that we can behave with them extremely different of how they behave with us. If we frame the political change as a vendetta, if we frame the political change as a revenge of the ones who suffered everything during these 20 years, there's no political change possible in Venezuela in a peaceful electoral way. And we understand that, and we are trying to work on that. And about a scenario of election without conditions, of course, that's possible. And what we want to say to everyone is that that possibility is growing every minute if we don't have a political agreement and the regime doesn't go back to the table. Even in that scenario, the Venezuelan democratic forces are going to run, and we're going to dispute the power to Nicolas Maduro. But of course, we want to do it with the best conditions and the bigger protection possible. But if done, we are still going to try, because it's our country what we're trying to recover. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone. And one super quick last comment about Claudio. I believe that the participation of the financial sector in this conversation helps a lot to erase bias, to erase invisible and walls that were there, and makes integral conversation a reality that wasn't happening before. Having diplomats, politicians, civil society, and financial sector trying to push in the same direction is also a good step forward. And I'm thankful with Chatham House and you, Chris, and Tamara, and everyone for this effort. Thank you.
And Miguel, I agree with you, obviously, but I think it's important too what you said, and this is why it's important. We have thoughtful, engaged business leaders involved, because also don't give it away for free. And this is part of, we want to craft a narrative that, there are asks that we share objectives on issues of negotiations and sufficiently free and fair elections, and that we're not here to advocate for lifting the sanctions under any conditions. Veronique.
Thank you. I think there were a lot of questions around concessions, around guarantees, around let's perhaps go back to basics a little, and this is what the Mexico negotiations are about: is to set out the different what needs to be recovered in the short term, and these are better electoral conditions. And in the long term, politically, there's quite a lot of recovery of institutions, of institutional independence that is required to put Venezuela back on track and on the path to democracy and the rule of law. On the donor side, what we can offer that is of interest to the government, and this has also been discussed with the opposition, is a range of concessions that can interest the government. And they go, I mean, Miguel mentioned it, they go from the diplomatic representation we actually currently don't recognize, we have European Council decision that says we do not recognize the 2018 elections. So we do not recognize the Maduro government. So there's a long way to go to normalization. And of course, I mean, Miguel mentioned the interest. Of course, the European companies are interested in gas and oil. And then there are the issue of sanctions. Just to clarify, the European Union does not have sectoral sanctions on oil, gas, or other sectors. We just have individual sanctions. But the imposition of these, what we call restrictive measures, we've always said that can be reversed as long as we see progress on the human rights front and on the respect of the democracy front. And this is the kind of trade-off we're looking at in a negotiation.
Thank you. Very, very, very good. Tamara.
Thanks. I'll be brief because a lot of what I wanted to say has been said already and we're running out of time. But just briefly, I think there are steps to this process. And I think the focus on electoral conditions is related because that's, what could come up to open the door to changes that we need to see in Venezuela eventually. And, we were talking about conditions to ensure like the opposition and who's in government today can live together in a next step. And for that, like I agree with Keith, Mark, about the need to have a conversation about, as I said earlier, like who needs to go to jail and for which crimes. But I think in essence, what, the second step or the medium long-term challenge is going to be strengthening the most basic democratic institutions, and that includes the judiciary. And that's where I do want to highlight and second what Miguel and Chris were saying about the private sector and the role of the private sector in strengthening the rule of law, because this is not only about democracy or human rights or accountability, it's about having clear rules of the game, legal certainty to promote investment. If we do want to rebuild Venezuela after that first initial conversation that hopefully will get us to some sort of free and fair elections, we're going to need everyone pushing in the same direction. And then the other final point I want to mention, which is the other big challenge that hasn't come up in this conversation, but is something that we can't forget about, is how is a democratic government going to deal with regaining control of areas of the country, particularly in the border, that are currently controlled by armed groups? That is an extremely huge challenge that anyone in power is going to have to deal with, and we can't forget about in the lead up to that conversation.
Thank you very much. Mariela, algunos puntos muy breves. ¿Quieres? Estás en mute.
Ok, muchas gracias, Cris, otra vez. Saludos a todos una vez más. Yo quiero agradecer las preguntas ante las inquietudes de quienes las han hecho, y efectivamente eso hace que el proceso se pueda ver en teoría lo que está pasando, la complejidad de este proceso de Venezuela. Y yo los invito a todos los que están presentes participando a leer el memorándum de entendimiento. Allí está la agenda en el cual está enmarcado el proceso de negociación. Obviamente con el tiempo que ha pasado, la importancia de que todos los sectores se involucren en el proceso hace más fuerte y sólido el resultado, porque no es solamente el tema económico, es el tema social, es el tema político. Y el 2024 los venezolanos tenemos una oportunidad para ir con condiciones electorales y lograr la transición a la democracia. Pero no termina allí. Comienza a partir de allí el proceso de reinstitucionalización y, por supuesto, el proceso a la transición que el venezolano quiere para poder vivir con calidad de vida y, sobre todo, en libertad y democracia. Es muy difícil lo que estamos haciendo, pero este trabajo y esta construcción de confianza que se ha venido haciendo en este año de trabajo desde Chatham House, en este proceso, en este capítulo Venezuela, particularmente para hablar del proceso de negociación y cómo aportar para la solución e inclusive la fluidez de este proceso, depende también de todos quienes se involucren. Este proceso tiene que tener dolientes y los dolientes somos los venezolanos y el aporte de la comunidad internacional que está interesada en que también en Venezuela y ha hecho ese acompañamiento haya la solución a la crisis, tenemos que aprovecharlo, construirlo y consolidarlo. No podemos olvidar que en Venezuela hay violación de derechos humanos sistemáticamente, que hay presos políticos y que ellos también merecen libertad, que hay violación, crímenes de lesa humanidad y que hay una situación social que cada vez más hace que los venezolanos escapen de Venezuela. Tenemos que apostar a un proceso de negociación confiable, serio, para que Venezuela salga de la crisis. Y estar aquí hoy, para mí siempre va a ser una oportunidad de mostrar, hablar y decir cómo es el proceso, cómo va el proceso y lo complejo que es, pero que es una oportunidad y una ventaja que tenemos para salir de esta crisis con condiciones electorales y poder lograr a que Venezuela llegue a la democracia. Muchísimas gracias, Cris, muchísimas gracias a todos los participantes, muchísimas gracias por las preguntas, por sus preocupaciones, porque eso genera un debate sano y nos invita a seguir trabajando como venezolanos en la interlocución y en la interacción de los problemas y las soluciones de Venezuela. Gracias.
Thank you, Mariela, and thank you again for your support in this. And we you know, we're not done yet. We're clearly not even back to negotiations, the election. So we'll be continuing this. So please, everyone, stay tuned. I just want to emphasize one thing too, is again, the diversity of this group that we've been adding to is its strength, I think. And it's, one of the questions was, what about the fans of Guaido on the Hill? I don't like that comment, to be honest, but the point is I do think, and I'm going to change what we do need are more voices sometimes. It isn't a question of people being captured or not, but we need more voices of people who care, who are involved, who are pushing for sensible change and recognition of the terrible situation in Venezuela, and not to normalize it. At the same time, understand that we are, in terms of sanctions policy, in a bit of a callejon, and we need to figure out how to combine that policy change with our original goals of negotiations and elections. So I will say one other thing is that this was recorded, and we'll be putting this on the Chatham House website. So if you want to go back and relive all the exciting twists and turns of this meeting, you can go back and watch it. More importantly, actually, you can circulate it to your friends and family and show them how the good things you're doing. I want to thank Claudio, Miguel, Mariela, Veronique, Tamara, Veronique's great team of Pablo and Ernesto too, and Alejandro, who are just fantastic. I'm not exaggerating when I say it's been a real pleasure to work with you on this and to continue to work on this. And if, as dire as the situation is and as frozen as it is, this should give us a little bit of hope that we are sort of pulling in the same direction with the same values and same objectives. So thank you. And I just want to emphasize Miguel's point that he said several times, which is, remember, the opposition actually is unified. It is heading into the primaries. It is resolving. It's a cheap narrative shot to claim that it isn't. It's politics. Not everyone is supposed to agree, but they're supposed to pull in the same direction around common objectives. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night or the rest of the day, wherever you happen to be. And we'll let you all know when it's up online. Bye-bye.